Hey fearsome friends, I hope you are all well and will be tuning into my live stream called Shed Talks that will be aired on Saturday the 12th of February 2022 at 6 p.m. EST and 11 p.m. UK time. We're going to discuss the unsolved case of JonBenet Ramsey and see what conclusions we can come to. I've got some crazy stories for you tonight, so sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside of Houston. Some people talk about neighborhoods where people don't lock their doors, but this wasn't one of those. Situations in Houston notoriously went from 0 to 100 quickly, so whilst the neighborhood was basically quiet, doors were locked and checked religiously. That being said though, 90% of the time, the big neighborhood problems would be teens vandalizing the area or car break-ins. Annoying but not really scary. I worked retail at a clothing store that closed at 9, and I worked with a woman I was becoming friends with who asked if I could give her a ride home. It was a little out of the way, but I didn't mind. Her neighborhood was pretty sketchy, and I don't know if that has anything to do with what happened later. But I drove her to her apartment, and we sat in the car and chatted until she was ready to head inside. I sat in the car to watch her go in, whilst around me other residents were outside drinking and shooting the breeze. It was around 10, so it would have been late for anyone in my neighborhood to be outside talking at volume like this on a weeknight. But it was expected at this place, so I didn't think much of it. When she got inside, she blinked the lights a couple of times to let me know she was in safe, and I headed for my childhood home. I should note here that this was a time before cell phones, so this was kind of a basic routine. I was to call her from my house once I was home, and everyone would be confirmed safe. I don't remember the drive home really. I probably blasted tunes and sang along as I usually did, and then just parked in the driveway. The outside lights were on, and Mum was good about turning them on for me, so I went inside with no fuss. Now a note about my parents. They weren't mean drunks, but they were alcoholics. They still functioned okay by day, but it wasn't uncommon for me to arrive upon a scene as I did that night with all the lights on, the TV going, and Mum passed out on the couch, with Dad presumably in the bedroom or passed out in his man cave. From experience, I also knew if I turned off the lights or the TV, Mum would wake up and be grouchy about me waking her up, so I left everything as it was and headed to the bathroom to brush my teeth and wash up for bed. Once in my room, I changed for bed, called my friend to let her know I was home, and all was well. One of my more annoying habits is that it's almost impossible for me to end a conversation. I'm tired as hell and just wanted to read a book or something, but instead we were just rambling at each other about work. I had already gotten into bed and turned the lights out, and was just laying in bed in the dark, listening to my friend rambling on the phone. My room was at the front of the house, and it had a weird wall in front of the window. Some stylistic mid-century modern thing that didn't make much sense, but it did block out some of the light from headlights when cars passed. Ours wasn't a high-trafficked road, but cars driving by and a square pattern of light on the upper part of my wall wasn't an unusual sight. What was unusual, though, were specific beams of light bouncing around the upper part of the wall to the ceiling, and I stared at them for a moment before realizing they were flashlights. That was highly unusual, but I figured it was just kids. I wasn't the sort of kid that other kids bullied or pranked, and we never had our house TP'd, and I couldn't imagine anyone would want to now that we were all graduated. I really needed to sleep now, though, because I had college finals the next day, and yet flashlights around the house was super weird. I mentioned it to my friend on the phone, and she told me to call the police, but for a variety of reasons I didn't want to. I'm just not a fan. Besides, carrying flashlights in my front yard isn't a crime, so I couldn't even imagine what the police would do anyway. I see well in the dark, and besides, the lights in the living room were still on, so still on the phone but without turning on any extra lights, I got up with the intent to check the front door. I really don't remember how long my friend and I were on the phone rambling for, but it had to have been a while for what happened next to have happened. I got to the living room, but I heard something in the kitchen. It was this weird metallic slapping sound that made no sense at all. I told my friend and she continued to caution me to call the police. But for what? Flashlights, metal sounds. The kitchen lights were also on, so you have to picture it. A brightly lit living room with a woman passed out on the couch, the TV on, the kitchen lights are on but not the dining room. But for all intents and purposes, this looked like a house where people were awake. Except for my mum, of course, who was very clearly dead to the world. So I headed towards the sound. At the very end of the kitchen, there was a smallish window with metal blinds, and they were closed, but rattling, making that weird metallic slapping noise. So I thought, is the window open? But we're not window-opening people. I know some people in the south open their windows on a nice evening, but that's not us. Sometimes windows are open temporarily when Mum would pass out whilst cooking dinner and something burned, but it was always for a very fixed time. It was possible she'd left the window open, but unlikely, so I just stood there staring at it, head cocked like a curious dog. And then I saw the front of a shoe on the sill, and I screamed. Actually, just saying that I screamed understates the noise that I made. I'm a notorious low talker, and I assumed that I'd just been saving all that volume for this precise moment. I wailed, I cried, I keened. I became a banshee and threw all my power into my voice in this mighty force. The foot vanished, my mum awoke, and my friend screamed on the phone with me. From the back of the house, my dad came bounding out with his gun, so I got off the phone and called the police. I grabbed another gun and headed outside behind my dad, but I'm not a gun person, and going outside was super stupid. But the scream to end all screams had apparently done its job, as no one was there any longer. Being kind of an expert in criminology due to watching police shows, I told everyone to stay away from the sill so the police could investigate it. I had visions of them taking fingerprints and moulding the shoe prints to find the culprit, which was adorable of me looking back. The police arrived an hour later, so it's good we weren't actually under attack. In the meantime, though, my mum started to doubt that I'd seen anything at all, and started to believe that she'd left the window open. But no. The police verified that the window had been pried open, that whomever it was had very carefully taken all the bric-a-brac that decorated the sill, and they'd set it on the ground, as if trying to remain very quiet. At no point before this did I consider what the invaders' plan was. Maybe it was shock or lack of imagination, or just being tired. But they knew it was a full house, and they were sneaking in. These weren't robbers who just wanted to take some electronics for quick cash. They were going to take us by surprise. And do what? Thoroughly chilled, I asked when they were going to take fingerprints, and the cop basically laughed at me because nothing was stolen. We locked down the windows, and I stayed up all night, trying not to imagine what exactly those people were going to do to us. So this happened around 10 years ago on a winter's evening. And where we live here in the UK, there are a lot of farms around, and most of the roads are unlit. Myself, my wife and stepson, who was 11 years old at the time, had just been to do some food shopping and were driving home. It was probably around 8 in the evening. We had just rounded a corner when I noticed in one of the fields there was an overturned car. I told my wife to pull over and thought I should check if the occupants were okay, which in hindsight was probably a very bad idea. I vaulted over the field gate and walked towards the car. The headlights were still on, the engine was running and the wheels were spinning. I was approaching the side of the car when I noticed a man appear from the opposite side of it, and he began walking around the back of the car towards me, so I backed away. As he came into the tail lights of the car, I noticed he was covered in blood, He had a knee-length dirty brown coat and an unkempt beard and hair, and I also noticed he was carrying what looked like a tire iron. He shouted to me to not ring the police, and I asked if he was okay. He replied that he was fine, but repeated not to ring the police, and made a motion towards me, so I backed away again. He paused, looking towards me, and then the edge of the field, where my wife and stepson were waiting in the car. We seemed to be stood there for ages, but was probably only 20 seconds or so. And at that moment I thought this was going to go either two ways. Him coming for me, or him just making a run for it. Luckily he dropped the tire iron and ran with a really bad limp towards my wife's car. So I ran back to the gate where I'd come from and stood in front of our car, to then see him hobble across the road and off into another field. I got back in our car, locked all the doors, explained what had happened to my wife, and decided to ring the police anyway. I explained the encounter, where the car was and where the man had run to, and they said they would look into it and may send someone to my house for a statement. The following day we had a visit from the police who took a statement, and I asked if they had found the man and if he was okay. They said they were having trouble locating him and weren't able to find the car or even evidence of a car crashing into the field. They said they would investigate more into it, but at this point, with no evidence of anything that had happened, there wasn't really much they could do. We did go back to see if we could find any trace of anything, but it was like nothing had ever happened. No hedge or fence damage, no skid marks either. It had been raining heavily, so the field was very waterlogged, so any footprints or tire tracks weren't visible. It's maybe not the creepiest story ever, but it certainly was very strange. I, a 17-year-old male, was with my girlfriend who is 18, and we were in England on a little getaway with my parents. Now, even though I'm 17, I definitely look a lot younger. I'm roughly 5'4", and due to that I occasionally get misaged by different people. Also, I wear a swimming top when I go in any swimming pool because I get anxious, and these facts are important for later. So my girlfriend and I decided it would be cool for us to go for a swim in the pool within the hotel. It was nothing super big or super small, and luckily there was only one other guy doing laps of the pool. Nothing remotely strange in the slightest. For the record, this was an inside pool, and I put down our towels and the key to our locker on a chair and got in. Around 5 minutes later, an older man, probably around 40 to 50, entered the room in a small pink bikini, which is obviously a bit odd to see and very uncommon. However, I don't actually have a real issue with it, as each to their own. What was weirder though is when he entered. My girlfriend and I kept very to ourselves, making minimal eye contact with anyone else in the pool, and we didn't speak either. However, the guy came over to us almost immediately and said, "Hey." Out of politeness, we both said hi back and smiled. Normal stuff. He would then swim around near to us and make eye contact repeatedly, specifically with me. I felt beyond uncomfortable at this point, as I just wanted a relaxing swim with my girlfriend. He continuously swam in our area until he made the comment about how he hoped I didn't mind that he wears ladies' clothes, as he's gay. Yes, he looked me in the eyes and said that. I felt slightly awkward because he was in a bikini. Not that there's anything wrong with that. However, I couldn't help but notice he was looking at me often. I was growing more and more uncomfortable, but I didn't want to be a nuisance and make my girlfriend get out because of it. Nothing much really happened whilst in the pool itself from that point, as we didn't move around much. We pretty much hovered in one spot talking, with me feeling slightly nervous. He went and spoke to the other guys swimming for a while, but kept peeking at me whilst doing so. To be honest, I think the other guy just wanted to swim, and didn't care what he was talking about. Then after that, the bikini guy got out. He went and laid down on the chair next to the one we had with our towels on, and I don't know if he'd specifically chosen that one, as he could clearly see it was ours, but I guess it could be excused as a coincidence. However, once my girlfriend walked away and I was grabbing my towel, he decided to ask in a specific tone about why I was wearing my swimming top. This gave me the strong impression that he was flirting with me, asking me why I wouldn't take my shirt off when I swim. I was stumped and answered with, because sunburn. Although keep in mind we were inside. I also said it just felt comfortable, as obviously we were inside and I probably looked beyond stupid. He smiled at me and said, "Oh, okay," or something along those lines. He then looked at me and said, "I think you would look better without it." This made my heart race, and I was ready to go. I was shocked he'd even had the guts to say that, so I just laughed it off and said bye. I feel like it was incredibly inappropriate to even ask a child why he wears swimming tops, let alone already have made it known that you are gay and you like wearing ladies' clothes, and then state I would look better topless. Sir, I have been mistaken as a 12-year-old in the last year. I have a deeper voice, and if you knew my age, I'm sure you would realize that I'm really 17. But initially a lot of people think that I am younger than that. I managed to escape and get dry and dressed in the changing rooms without him coming in at all. I'm really interested in hearing your opinions and how you feel about this situation, and if you think it was completely normal, or if it seemed like there was weird intent. I understand it's different when you're in that particular situation, as you can probably understand emotion and intent with someone. But still, what do you think? When I was a teenager, there was one night I had been hanging out with my friends, and I didn't have a way to get home, but I wasn't allowed to stay either. I just ended up walking around the centre of town. I came across this alley in between a church and some other building, and it was a kind of grungy place to smoke and kill some time. But the interesting part was that the word paradox was spray painted on the brick foundation of the church. So I sat down and started talking to myself, just kind of thinking out loud to stay entertained and awake. It's important that I express here that I was talking out loud to myself, not like an imaginary friend or anything like that. I'm not mad. Then I got up and started walking again, before I heard that one blast of a siren and a police car pulled up next to me. I knew the cop because he was an assistant coach at my school. Then he asked me why I was out so late, so I told him. He asked me where my friend had gone, and I thought, what do you mean? He explained that he'd seen me talking to another kid in the alleyway before he'd pulled up, but I told him I was just talking to myself. When he looked at me confused and said, "No, I saw another kid sitting across from you. I was watching the whole time." He was deadly serious. It was like he thought I'd actually had a friend with me, but they'd run away when they saw a cop car. He ended up driving me back to my house, thankfully, and looking back on it, I think maybe he was just messing with me, or maybe his eyes were mistaken by a shadow or something. But at the time, it creeped me the hell out. So I was in bed trying to remember some creepy things that have happened to me, and I had some flashes, but I didn't remember enough to make a story out of it. When suddenly one incident popped into my head, so here it is. One day I was at a mall with my parents to do some shopping. The mall is small, so you can pretty much visit all the shops quickly, and we were going towards the restaurant area, when my parents and I noticed some little red spots on the floor. We were a bit disturbed by it, but quickly rationalized it by saying that it was probably just a mess someone had made with food or something. So without thinking any more of it, we continued on our way to the restaurant area. Everything went fine and we all enjoyed our meals. But when we went back to the place where we'd seen the red spots, this time the police and some yellow tape was in place. Now in shock, we realized that what we'd first thought was confirmed. It was blood. We didn't dare to ask the cops what had happened, so we kept walking to the exit to make our way home. Just then I recognized one of my old friends, so I said hi to her and asked if she knew about the murder scene inside the mall. She told us that apparently a son had stabbed his father. My parents and I were shocked to hear that, and what is more crazier is that we hadn't heard a thing whilst we were eating. Not a cry, a yell, nothing. I just did a little research about that day, and there were a lot of different news articles reporting on the same thing, as they do. The son was 40 years old and was arrested after stabbing his father of 72. The father went to the emergency room, and his injuries were life-threatening. The reason why the son had done it, though, was that apparently he was having a spiritual attack, and the energy waves from it were manipulating him. So yeah, really creepy. I'm a 20-year-old female, and I matched with this guy on Tinder a while back. His name was Nick, and he seemed pretty cool. So I gave him my Snapchat and we talked a little bit, but it died out quickly. I didn't tell him the exact town I lived in, but the city that I'm closest to, which is about 10 minutes away. Now, because it's decent sized and has a large population, I figured he wouldn't be able to find me by just knowing that little bit of information. A few weeks ago, he started messaging me. We made small talk again, and everything seemed normal for a while. That is, until New Year's Eve. The day before, he messaged me, saying he was going to be in the area, specifically the city I told him I was from, and asked if I wanted to meet for lunch. I told him that yes, possibly, and I would let him know shortly. The next night, I had a New Year's Eve party with a small group of my friends, so I spent most of the day getting ready and was not looking at my phone. When around 7:30 came, I finally looked at Snapchat and saw that Nick had not only messaged me but called also. "Hey, I'm in the city," he wrote. I responded by telling him I was sorry that I'd only just seen his message. He opened it within minutes and totally freaked out, saying something like, "Just to let you know, I'm really not interested in someone who can't even answer the phone when I drive 6 hours just to see her." I looked at it in disbelief, and for a second I thought he was joking. I responded by asking him what he was talking about, and that he didn't drive 6 hours just to see me. He said that we'd had plans, and why else would he drive up here? I was confused because we never had made plans. He told me that he was going to be in the area, which made me think he was here for work or to visit a friend. It's not uncommon for people to travel here for work, and I explained this. I told him that we did not have plans, and that I didn't ask him to drive all that way for me. He told me he'd sat around for 2 hours waiting for me, and had even bought me flowers. Again I was confused, because we'd never planned a time or place to meet, and had never confirmed anything. You don't make plans by just telling someone you're going to be in the area. I apologized, but told him again that we never had plans. He told me to make it up to him by driving up to see him the next day. Yeah, I don't think so. I remembered that I had my location shared on Snapchat, so he could have easily shown up at my house. So I turned it off, but kept him on Snapchat just in case he tried to show up at my house. Luckily, though, I haven't heard from him since. My dad is a retired police officer and has a gun, and I'm not afraid to use it. So this happened to me in July of this year, and I just want to give context of where I was to discount any of the possible wildlife explanations. At the time, I lived in the Midwest, in a suburban area, which is fairly populated, near a very populated city, and there was nowhere that could be considered rural within at least a 40-mile radius. It was late at night and I was hanging out with my golden retriever, Leo, who was just turning a year old in a couple of weeks at the time. I was just watching YouTube in my room whilst he lay on the floor next to me, and it was around 12:30 a.m. We were ready for bed, and I had to take him out before we both went to sleep, so I got him on his leash and we went outside. My family and I lived in a large complex, and the apartments have quite a few rooms and their own personal garage, and there's 8 to 10 apartments per building, so they're very long and slim. Behind our building is a long strip of grass that goes out about 15 feet. Then there's a large tree line that's 20 feet deep and about 200 feet long. Leo and I went out the front around to the back of the building, as we don't have an exit to the back. We're on the 2nd floor and we all have our own separate entrances. And we made it to the back to the grassy area, walking out into the grass to let him do his business. I was on my phone not really paying attention, and we stood there for a good minute. I realized it had been a good amount of time and noticed that Leo hadn't moved a muscle. I turned off my phone and looked at him and realized he hadn't moved from the spot we'd stopped at. He was looking at the other building, right by the woods, and had been frozen the whole time. I pet him and he looked up at me, and when I stopped petting him, he looked straight back at the same spot. I hadn't at the time realized he was looking at that particular place the whole time until then, and looked over to where he was looking at. My eyes weren't adjusted to the darkness, so I could only see the shadow of the building. The only source of light was street lights about 50 feet behind us. Then I looked back at him and quietly chuckled, because I thought he'd just heard a squirrel which had made him perk up, which was very cute. I then looked back at my phone thinking nothing of it, when Leo, out the corner of my eye about 15 seconds later, flinched back as if he'd been startled by something and started to whine. I looked over at the spot this time, realizing now he was scared of something. My eyes were now adjusted to the dark, and I could see what he was fixated on now. In the shadow of the building right next to the corner of the wall, in front of the tree line, was a creature. I could only see a black outline as it was not lit up enough, but it was massive. I know how tall the building was relative to me, and when it was standing right next to the building, it was about 5 feet tall. Now that wouldn't be tall if it was standing upright, but this thing was on all fours. The best way I can describe how it looked is when a bulldog snarls and kind of flexes its front legs when trying to intimidate, but was scaled up to be 5 feet tall and had more muscle. There is no way that this was any creature native to the Midwest. The only creature that is remotely close to that is a black bear, and we only get those way up north. Also, there are no woods for a bear to live in anyway, as stated in the beginning of the story. Plus, the max height of a bear on all fours can be 3 feet and not very broad. This thing surpassed that by a long shot and was very broad. I jumped back in fear and was just frozen for a solid 30 seconds, just staring at it. I then backed away slowly, keeping my eye on it the whole time. Leo then began to growl and snarl at it, and we rounded the corner. Leo has never acted aggressively like that ever before, so this just made me even more terrified. I then peeked around the corner no more than a second later, and it was gone. No noise and no shadow, swiftly moving behind the building. It was just gone. There's no way something could have moved behind the building that fast without a sound, especially of that size. This freaked me out even more, and I sprinted back inside the building. I would really like to think that I was hallucinating and I was just tired, but it was clear as day, even during the night, and I have never told anyone this story before. It still freaks me out to this day. I was walking my dog around 11:30 p.m. on a street that has no houses on it, only industrial sheds and woods on one side, and the railroad tracks on the other where trains go by every few hours. This street is only the next street over from the residential neighbourhood block where I live, and I walk my dog here several times a day, usually one late final walk around this time. It's a nice street to walk my dog on, because the woods make it seem more like a nature walk rather than walking down a street full of houses. I like that I can see the stars better on this road too, because there are no streetlights, and I like seeing the wildlife occasionally, which consists of several young raccoons running up a tree when me and my dog go by, a feral cat's eyes shining in the dark as it hunches in the distance, and the sound of an owl hooting. This particular night, as I was walking my dog, I saw headlights of an approaching vehicle. Now, it's not unusual, of course. Vehicles use this street as a thoroughway throughout the day, especially after the city made a park at the end of the street where the road goes around a bend. But generally, there's hardly any traffic at this hour. Sometimes the local police patrol through, but other times it could be sketchy people. During the day, I find empty beer bottles and cans and tiny liquor bottles that were tossed out of vehicles, so periodically I carry a small trash bag and pick up the litter to keep my nature walk pleasant. However, as the vehicle got closer, I kept checking the headlights as I was standing on the side of the road, letting my dog sniff around. I checked every now and then to make sure the driver was staying on their side and not driving erratically, perhaps under the influence or driving whilst texting, because I obviously don't want to be hit. I kept my cell phone flashlight shining on my dog, who is on the grass sniffing around, so the driver knows I'm there and thankfully kept on their side of the road. So standing there facing my dog, I took one last look over my shoulder at the vehicle as it approached to where I was. Then I looked back at my dog as to not rudely stare. As the vehicle passed behind me, I heard it then slow down, so I turned to face it. It had stopped a little past where I was, so I held my phone flashlight so it shone on the car and driver. It was a man, young looking, maybe still in high school, but probably in his early 20s, and he had a round face with what looked like short whiskers all over the bottom half. I waited to see what he was up to and said nothing. I just shone my light on him. "I like your dog," he said. "Thank you," I replied politely, with emphasis on the first word. It's my standard response for when people say, "I like your dog." It's usually kids that ride on their bicycles or skateboards during the day, and a few older women who have stopped in their cars with their husbands driving them. You see, my dog is a Great Pyrenees, which is a large breed that is big and fluffy looking, so people often comment that she looks like a polar bear. It's not super unusual for someone to stop in a car to ask what breed my dog is, or to say that they like it. But this time it felt very weird, especially being that it was 11:30 p.m. on a dark, deserted road that has no houses, and just a guy that thinks it's okay to stop. After a pause, he said, "You're welcome," politely, with emphasis on the second word, and in a tone that I thought almost seemed surprised that I'd said thank you. Or perhaps he was simply mirroring my response. I said nothing else then, just waited, still shining the flashlight on my phone in his direction, waiting for him to leave. It felt very inappropriate for someone to stop their car late at night on a deserted street to talk to a person who is walking their dog, especially a woman who is alone. Maybe he just didn't realize this, or he might not have had a lot of social skills or social intelligence. He looked like he might be a bit awkward. After a few seconds that seemed longer than they were, he then began to drive away. Slowly at first, and then picked up speed. When the car was a little distance away, I heard someone scream out of the vehicle, "You're an effing bitch." Then farther away, as the car went around to turn at the end of the street, I heard another scream from the vehicle, calling me an effing C-word. I stood there thinking, what the hell? At first I thought there might have been someone else, another guy in the car who was the one screaming, but then I thought it couldn't have been. This has given me pause for thought, and now I make sure to carry pepper spray when I go out. I might just hide in the woods until cars pass by in the dark too, There are too many weirdos and psychopaths in the world. So I grew up in a small beach town on the East Coast, and it had that cliché suburbia vibe, complete with book clubs and block parties. My sister and I were close friends with our neighbours, as they had a daughter called Kristen, who was around our age. A lot of time was spent playing together in our shared yards, at the beach down the street, or our nearby park. It had been one summer day that my mum and Christine's mum decided to take us to this particular park. And as per usual, as soon as we'd arrived, Kristen, my sister and I raced to the swing set to claim our seats. Our mums had followed leisurely behind us, looking ahead to see if they could snag a spot in the shade. Once they'd chosen a picnic table, they sat down and set everything up. They chatted and got some snacks ready for us, occasionally glancing over to make sure we hadn't fallen off the swings. The afternoon was going well and everyone was having fun and enjoying the weather, when just then Christine's mum pointed across to where we were playing. Instead of just 3 kids swinging, there were now 4. Seems like the girls have made a friend. She smiled at my mum as they looked at the other little girl who had joined us. Then the older woman, possibly her mother, was standing off to the side as well. My mum nodded, thinking nothing of it, as it was of course completely normal for kids to make friends at the park, and especially in an area so friendly. Besides, my mum, assuming the older woman was with the little girl, she would be able to help if anything happened. They proceeded to talk for a little bit longer before my mum thought to look over again to check up on us. But when she glanced over to the swings, she saw Kristen, she saw my sister, but she no longer saw me. She stared for one more second as it sunk in, and then realized the older woman was also not there. Panic washed over her and she immediately alerted Kristen's mum. They rushed over, hoping I was just hiding behind the slide, and my mum's eyes scanned over the playground, frantically trying to find me. She recalls Kristen's mum taking the other 2 girls by the hand, attempting to ask them what they'd seen happen. But before either of them were able to offer any information, her eyes locked on me. The older woman had taken me by the hand and was leading me off of the playground, out of the gate, and into the parking lot. My mum began to run after her, not saying a word except to yell for her to stop. But the woman didn't pause, not even turn around to acknowledge my mum's screams, until she was close enough to reach out and grab my one free hand. My mum immediately began to curse and question what the hell she was doing with me, and the older woman began to explain how this was a misunderstanding and how she was only just walking me to the baseball field that was right across the street. Of course, this answer was completely unacceptable, and my mum was making this clear, as Kristen's mum was quickly catching up behind and coming to aid in whatever way she could. It appeared that when the older woman had noticed Kristen's mum was there as a backup, she let go of my hand and began to offer some semblance of an apology before hurrying to her car and quickly pulling away. And it wasn't until after she had already gotten down the street that my mum understood 2 suspicious details. The direction the older woman was walking me was towards her parked car, and not at all the baseball field. And the older woman did not put a child in the car before she left, meaning she'd come to a playground of kids by herself. I often ask my mum why she didn't call the police, and honestly, she doesn't have a good answer. She told me that it was just shock, and I'm sure part of it was, but I also think it could have been partially due to embarrassment. However, I hope it's not at all, and there was no way she could have expected this to happen, and she may very well have saved my life that day, and I try to make it as clear to her as I can. While I'm now in my 20s, and this happened when I was a toddler, I still think about it from time to time, at least this recounted version of that my mum tells. It's a very scary idea to think that if she hadn't seen me in time, I could have had a completely different path in life. I hope this woman never actually got the chance to take any kids who didn't know her into her car. Growing up as a teenager, it was just me and my mum that lived together. Our house was in the country, about 40 miles away from the big city that we lived close to. And when I started high school, it was a private one in the big city, which is where my mum also worked. For convenience, my mum bought a house near to my school and her work, but we kept the country house for weekends. It's important to know that this country house was in some fancy-pants gated, secured, and patrolled neighbourhood, and it was a 2-story house, of which we never went upstairs in. Maybe once a year when my mum would host Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner, but the upstairs was an informal living area, with a bar, a bathroom, and a game room. There just wasn't any regular reason to go up there. Also, the downstairs dining room and formal living room were absolutely 100% off limits. I was never allowed to walk in there or go in there unless it was a hosted dinner like Christmas or Thanksgiving, and it was kept like a museum, oddly. I never really moved into the city house. I'd kept all of my clothes and belongings in the country house because we still had a lot of our animals there. I would drive home every day after school to do my homework, feed the animals, watch TV and do stuff around the house. And after my homework was done, I would pack an overnight bag of clothes for the next day at school and then drive to the city house. We did, however, spend all of our weekends back home at the country house. One day I came home after school and was pottering around. I finished my homework and animal duties and went to pack my bag for the next day. My dresser drawers were really messed up, and things weren't really folded anymore, so it looked as if someone had been rummaging through my clothes. I thought I must have made the mess the last time I was packing, and as I went to go and leave the house, I saw a crystal bowl turned upside down on one of the living room tables. I was honestly shocked I'd even noticed, but I had because everything in that room was kept in museum-like quality. I thought it was odd, but nothing more of it. Then I went to our city house. The next day I was back at the country house after school, had finished my homework and animal duties, but this time my closet seemed a bit in disarray. At this point I thought, holy shit, my mum must have come in the middle of the day to see if I had drugs or something in my room. Which I didn't. I wasn't into anything like that. However, when I was leaving the house, I noticed there was a second crystal bowl turned over on one of the living room tables, right next to the first one. So this time it definitely stood out to me. I went into the room and completely surveyed the area. And yes, there were only 2 bowls turned over. I drove to the city house and asked my mum if she'd gone through my room, but she denied it and asked me, "Do you think someone has been in the house?" I said no, because, well, nothing was missing. Plus in the back of my head I was thinking, it's in a gated, patrolled and secure neighbourhood, so no one could have gotten in. The third day I went to school, and a girl a year younger than me that attends my private high school actually lives directly across the street from our country house. On the off chance we ever stayed the night there, I always drove her to school with me, and this day she came up to me and said, "We saw you leaving your driveway this morning and we flashed our lights at you. But it was foggy, so I guess you didn't see us." At this point I was definitely thinking it must have been my mum going through my room, because Mum and I, at the time, drove matching white Mercedes, so I was thinking my neighbour had seen my mum's car leaving. I drove to the country house after school again, and walked in immediately to see a third bowl turned upside down in the living room. Chills covered my entire body, and when I walked into my room, the bed sheets had been stripped, my pillowcases were gone, and so many things from my bookshelves were missing. It was completely ransacked. I immediately ran outside of the house and called my mum, and then the police. When the police showed up, my mum, who was driving to the house but still on the phone with me, asked me to go into her bedroom closet and look under the stack of jeans on her highest shelf. But there was nothing there. It was apparently one of the 3 places my mum kept her jewellery. She started sobbing, asking me to check under her underwear in the drawer. And no jewellery there either. She asked me to check her armoire under her winter sweaters, and nothing there either. She was hysterical at this point, and asked me to check under the stove, but there was nothing there. That's where she kept the heavy wooden box of silverware that her parents had brought over from Sweden when they moved to America. Everything that was of considerable value or heritage was completely gone. Every little thing. The security gate had 0 unauthorized visitors on their cameras, and none of them were in a white Mercedes, which is from my neighbor's testimony. That's what her and her mom saw coming out of our driveway that one morning. The police did a full sweep of the house and identified a space in the upstairs game room where someone had apparently been living, and there were soda cans in the attic that is accessed through a small door in the upstairs bar. Apparently I had been coming home as a 16-year-old, whilst someone, or multiple persons, had been living in our upstairs spaces and been doing a full scope of the house and all the assets to steal. To add insult to injury, my mother died unexpectedly about 3 weeks after the robbery had happened. Anything at all of value of hers or of heritage to my Swedish family was gone. Everything. The insurance claim my father had to make, who was entirely out of the picture, turned out to be $480,000. And the worst part is that I'm 16 years old. Remember how my neighbor had seen a white Mercedes coming out of our driveway? Well, the local police in the very small town village had tried to charge me with the robbery and insurance fraud, assuming I'd taken everything. This whole experience lasted only about 2 weeks, but it was intensely brutal. I cried pretty much non-stop, as my mother had just died on top, and I was working with lawyers to fight my innocence against stealing valuable family assets or heirlooms. I was working at my first job ever in retail, and I was around 20 years old. It was a busy 9 a.m. morning, hence why it was so busy. I was working the checkouts as per usual, scanning items, ringing up customers and all that jazz. When about an hour into my shift, I was serving an elderly man who'd bought just a handful of items, and after giving him his subtotal, another guy behind him, smelling of booze, stretched his hand out, giving me cash. I kindly told him that I wasn't serving him. I was still serving the man in front of him. Then I looked down and saw that he was buying some cheap knockoff branded Baileys, some booze, and of course I figured out this guy was wasted. Just as I was taking payment from the elderly man, I was planning in my head how I was going to tell the next guy that I can't sell alcohol to him, as he was already drunk. Plus this was my first job, and I've never encountered this sort of thing before. So I finished serving, and now was on to the drunk guy. I looked around in hopes of finding another colleague or my manager, but not one of them was in sight or available to help. So I looked at the man, and just before I opened my mouth, I felt like someone was grabbing a fistful of my hair and something sharp poking me in the back. Then a man whispered in my ear, at which point I also smelt alcohol. "Serve my mate," he said, and pushed what I was assuming was a knife harder into my back. "Now," he demanded. In complete shock, I said nothing, just scanned the bottle, took the cash, and thankfully they were gone. I quickly turned around to my colleague behind me, who was also working checkouts, but all they did was look at me and asked if I was okay, completely unaware of what had just happened. I then went for my break and saw my manager pass by, so I rushed over to him and told him what had happened. But all he did was laugh, because he thought I was joking, then criticized me for selling alcohol to someone under the influence. Whatever that sharp object was that was in my back had actually cut me, as before my break I could feel blood running down my back, and it was sore. Of course I couldn't see blood as my uniform is black, but I screamed, "It's true, it did happen." Then I turned around, lifted my hair and said, "Lift up my shirt, or get her to do it. That guy sliced me." But the manager just said, "Ooh, no, I don't want to lift up your shirt," and just walked away, staring into his phone. Needless to say, I didn't return to finish my shift and snuck out of the store. I got a taxi and went home, where my mum cleaned up my back and dressed my wound. The next morning she called my work to tell them I wouldn't be returning, as the manager's incompetence to take action when I was almost stabbed over a bottle was disgusting. This happened a long time ago, and at the time I was living alone in a first-floor apartment. My girlfriend had been sick and ended up in the hospital dealing with a rare disease that she luckily recovered fine from. But during those weeks, my life was pretty much go to work, go to the hospital to be with her, come back to the house for dinner, and then go to bed. It was a Friday night and I was alone. So I decided to distract myself by reading and watching some videos on YouTube. Hours passed, and by 3 a.m. I was in bed with my iPad in hand, almost falling asleep, when I heard it. I knew the sound pretty well. You see, right outside of my bedroom door, there was a long corridor that leads directly to the kitchen. The apartment was in a building built back in the 50s, and the kitchen door was old and had become slightly bent. That meant that whenever you turned the doorknob to open it, it would snap out of its place with a distinct clack sound, and that was the sound I'd just heard. A lot of thoughts ran through my mind in that moment. Had I dreamt it in my semi-sleeping state? Or maybe the sound was real, but what actually happened was that the doorknob's internal mechanism broke, and it opened by itself. Or, of course, maybe someone was in my house, and they just opened the door. At this point, my heart was racing, and I started considering my options. I had a broomstick next to my bed, and you may ask why, but to be honest, I had it precisely because I lived alone, and thought that one day I might be in a situation like this where I would need a weapon. My girlfriend even used to joke about it, but I guess that my paranoia was now paying off in the most unfortunate of situations. So I decided I was going to take the stick in one hand and grab my cell phone in the other. I would open my bedroom door whilst calling 911, and if no one else was in the apartment, I would just apologize to the operator on the other end of the line and explain the situation. However, back in those days, my cell phone wasn't yet a smartphone, and it had this feature I'd found interesting, even though I never used it. If you pressed on a couple of specific keys, it would start ringing like someone was calling you. It was meant to be used when you wanted to simulate you getting a call to get out of a boring conversation or a tough situation. But clumsily I pressed on those keys, and the phone started ringing. I quickly shut it up, but now it had become clear inside the apartment that I was awake. If someone was outside my bedroom, they certainly heard it. So what was going to happen now? I stopped for a few seconds to hear my surroundings, and there was nothing. It was dead quiet, so I decided to continue with my plan. I dialed 911 with one hand, raised the broomstick with the other, and quickly opened the door. And as I did that, someone sprinted in front of me in the corridor and quickly went into the kitchen, closing the door behind them. I screamed "Hey!" and started pursuing them, but a split second later I thought, stop. What if there is someone else in the apartment? What if there's someone else in the apartment? What if another intruder sneaks up on you from behind? In front of me was the corridor to the kitchen, but on my left was another corridor that led to the living room and office. The office had the light on, so the intruder had been there, but I didn't know if he had company. I took a step back into the entrance of my room so that I wouldn't be caught off guard. "Sir, are you there?" The 911 operator was calling for me on the phone. I quickly explained to him what was happening, gave him my address, and he told me the police were on their way. They had a patrol car nearby, so I should just wait. Then he hung up. The apartment was dead silent, and I was terrified. There were only 3 things I had been able to notice about the intruder before they'd disappeared. He had a light-coloured sweatshirt with horizontal black lines, dark hair, and he smelled really bad. In fact, the smell was still in the apartment, and I could still sense it. The police arrived after 7 or 8 minutes, which felt like ages, and the apartment door was next to the bathroom, so I managed to quickly approach it and unlock it to let them in. I explained what had happened to the police, and they said that we should go through the whole apartment and check every single hiding place. They had seen situations before where a burglar had hidden himself for a long period, even after the house owners had called the police, and they would then go on to attack them. The apartment wasn't that big, so it was easy to conclude that there was no one hiding there. But in the kitchen it was obvious what had happened. It had these large windows that faced the back of the building, where we had a small community garden. I had left one of the windows open, and next to it on the outside, there was a large drain pipe along the wall, and the intruder had used that pipe to climb to my window and get in. The police left to go look around the neighbourhood for someone matching the description of the sweatshirt that I'd described, and whilst they were gone, I could still smell that horrible odour. After around 20 minutes they came back, saying they hadn't found anyone, and the burglar was long gone. Luckily he didn't have the chance to steal anything whilst he was in my apartment. But the audacity. I mean, he must have seen the light on in my bedroom through the edges of the door, and still he tried walking past it to steal something from the office. I didn't sleep that night, and in the morning I went to the garden in the back to try to find any further clues about the intruder, but was unsuccessful. A neighbour in the building next door was at the window, and I called out to her. I told her what had happened, and she just smiled and said, "Well, welcome to the neighbourhood. We all have stories like that in this place. You should never leave your windows open, and maybe you should consider getting some bars to protect them." The next day I bought a motion alarm, installed it in the kitchen, and I never had another experience like that again. But to be honest, I never slept the same way in that bedroom, traumatized by those events. At night I would fear the sound of the kitchen door snapping out of its place again. A few years later I moved out to a larger apartment in another neighbourhood, and this time it was on the 7th floor, so it would be much harder for intruders to get in through the windows. A few years back, when I was 17 years old, I went to a party and everything was fine, until the host started getting really intense and creepy. By that point it was around 3 a.m. and I was pretty dark, so I decided to call an Uber in order to avoid any advances from the insistent guy. The Uber showed up and I tried to sober up when I got in. The driver began to make small talk, and in the state I was, I failed to see the red flags. He started to ask me about the party I was at, so I told him about the creep. Then he told me it was because I was short and cute, then asked my age. Sensing a weird vibe from him, I told him I was a minor, thinking that would deter any further advances, but it turned out that was a horrible idea. He was driving pretty recklessly on the highway, and I snapped out of my drunken stupor real fast. He then asked me to go get drinks with him that same night and told me he really liked me. I quickly told him I'd get grounded if I stayed out any later, and that my mother was awake and waiting for me at home. Keep in mind, I lived in Mexico, and the amount of people, especially women, that get murdered daily is ridiculously high. When we got to my home address, I noticed the doors were locked, and he kept on insisting on us going out for a drink, even though by now it was almost 4 a.m. I tried to act as nicely as possible, when I told him I couldn't that night. He then asked for my phone number and told me we could go out the next day. So not being the first time that some creep had asked for my number, I gave it to him, but changed the last digit so he couldn't actually contact me. But then he dialed the phone as I was getting out of the car, so of course my phone didn't ring, and he started getting agitated, saying I'd given him the wrong number. So I played drunk and stupid and recited my number again, but actually said it correctly in order for him to think he'd heard the last number wrong. He chuckled and said it was his bad, and told me we'd see each other the next day. I made my way into my house and immediately woke my mom up because I was terrified. She managed to calm me down and told me to go to sleep, so I went into my bedroom and started putting my pajamas on, when I heard my phone ring. The Uber driver was trying to video call me, and I lost my shit when I saw that on my screen. I immediately denied the call and then noticed he'd sent me about 15 messages asking what time he could come pick me up and why I wasn't replying. Of course, I blocked him right away and thought that would be the end of it. But the next day I got a text from an unknown number and checked the picture to see it was the driver. He asked me why I'd blocked him and started spamming me, and I immediately blocked him again. Over the course of the next month, I'd get messages from random phone numbers, and it quickly became obvious that it was the driver. I would always block him, but eventually I reported him on the Uber app and changed my number. The only problem is, he knows where I live. This happened around 2013, when I was either 12 or 13 at the time. I'm the middle child of 3, and have been dubbed the responsible one for most of my life. On this particular night, I would be in charge of watching my siblings whilst my mum and grandparents went out. It wasn't often that my grandparents would leave the house, so when they did, they'd often be gone for the whole day. This was great in the eyes of my siblings and I, though, mostly due to the fact that they enjoyed whatever I cooked them, and we each got free time without the judgmental eyes of our very strict grandparents. After dinner, I decided to enjoy time outside of my shared bedroom and take a seat in the living room. Now, if you are online frequently around this time, you'd know this was when the creepypasta fandom was at its peak. I was, and still am 10 years later, a huge fan of the scary stories online. So because of my hyperfixation at the time, I loved letting my imagination get the best of me. I often used my free time on Omegle, in hopes that I would find friends with similar interests, and this happened often. Though of course, as a naive young girl on the sketchy site, I often got my fair share of creepy encounters on there as well. This particular night, a friend of my best friend at the time, whom I'd met online, had found me on Omegle. They knew it was me due to my scream name that I used for just about everything. However, I'd never formally spoken to this person. They were a little older and thought it would be hilarious to scare me. So they, along with our mutual friend behind the scenes, used personal information and a sort of glitched font through the text feature, effectively beginning to scare the piss out of me. Eventually I'd had enough, so I slammed my laptop shut and nervously shot my friend a message, telling him about my encounter. He urged me not to panic too much, knowing it was truly nothing to worry about, but I remained on edge. So when my small, almost always silent dog Abby started barking viciously at the door, I immediately felt my palms sweat and my heart race. It was already pitch black outside, and in the front yard there was a single streetlight across the street. In the back we had about 2.5 acres of wooded land. So I attempted to comfort Abby, but she was the most terrified and on guard that I had ever seen her. Even to this day she's never growled like that. I didn't know why, but I desperately wanted to know what was out there, and I thought for sure I'd see a horrible creature or person like described in the Omegle chat before. They had described my house and my life, so surely it was them outside. I don't know why I opened the door. It wasn't even locked due to how low the crime rate was in our area. But despite Abby standing firm and angry growling, and despite knowing something bad could be out there, I turned the knob anyway. I felt like I just had to. I gripped the old, cold knob, opened the door quickly, and at first there was nothing. I stepped onto our small porch slowly, sighing in premature relief, before I heard a crunch. The crunch of leaves beneath me under the porch. I froze, and right as I did, a terrible creature, person, I'm not sure what, bolted from under the porch. It looked exactly like the old classic photo of the rake, but with much longer, lankier limbs, and the bones showed up much more, like someone with severe anorexia, but was running on all fours. From what I could see in the very little amount of lighting, it was completely hairless. Its limbs were long, and you could see the scrawny, malnourished frame even as it ran. It ran so damn fast. I couldn't move, and I couldn't scream. Not until Abby darted after the creature down the road is when I began to panic. I screamed and cried for Abby to come back, and right as I did, I heard a horrible, monstrous screeching, then a loud yelp from Abby. I watched her tiny body running full speed back towards me, up the porch and inside, but I didn't stop to take in the scenery anymore. I ran inside behind her and slammed the door shut, then locked it and began checking every window as I cried and questioned reality itself. As I did all this, my sister came into the living room, asking why I was yelling and crying. I simply told her that Abby had almost run out in front of a car, but that she was okay. Upon further examination, I found that to luckily be the truth, as the creature hadn't hurt her, so I assumed she realized the major size difference once she tried to face it and got scared. I kept it to myself as to not terrify my siblings, but immediately told my mum the whole story when she got home. She tried to calm me down, saying it could have been a deer or another random woodland animal, but when I called my best friend, he felt responsible for my intense fear. As I cried into the phone as he told me about his friend trying to scare me. The friend even shot me a message to apologize profusely, but I assured them that what they'd done was nothing compared to what I saw out there. I know what I saw that day, and I will always stand by it. Whatever was lurking under our porch looked deformed, non-human, and ran faster than anything I'd ever seen in person. Whatever was under our porch has made me believe that anything can potentially exist. So I need some insight or someone that has experienced something like this. I used to live in a small town, and our house was located down a long dirt road with trees on each side, with large farmer fields behind them, divided by your typical metal-wired fences. Well, one evening, my friend and I decided to take a walk as the sun set, so we could get our daily exercise and kill some time and enjoy the view. Sometimes our neighbours' cows would get out of their field, and we would have to go round them up and lead them back into the gates. My friend was walking in front of me a fairly decent distance away, and for some reason I looked behind me, but all I could see was reflective eyes from the trees. I didn't think anything of it, except that maybe it was a cow that had gotten loose again, as the atmosphere didn't seem off by any means. So I went over to the spot where I saw the eyes and came to a complete stop. I could see this long, skinny creature standing there, hunched over with no genitals, no expression, grey skin, no nose, and these sunken, almost black eyes. I didn't feel fear, but I was in shock, and felt as if I was almost unable to move. The creature must have been looking at me the whole time, because he didn't break eye contact, and his head was in my direction, even when my friend came running up. When he came up, we ran off as fast as we could, and I never looked back. Now, some people have said it was a Wendigo or a Skinwalker, but it didn't try to attack, and it didn't make any noises. Someone explain, please. So just to provide you with some background, the apartment block I lived in was huge. And if you've ever watched Sweet Home, imagine that block but triple the size. Then you get a good image of where I lived. It was in a very empty part of the city, which was pretty much in the middle of nowhere, with barely any buildings around. And initially when I moved in, the place was rather nice. It was my second owned apartment, and the first one in decent shape, so I was happy I could get it for a good price. But then developers started building a very nice new neighborhood next to it, and people started moving out. Perhaps to get new apartments in the newly built blocks, as this one was very cheap. Well, less decent people started catching the deals and moving in, and the place spiraled down to hell. Trash bags, empty alcohol bottles, and suspicious pools of liquid were appearing in the halls and stairways. And then were the people. In the apartment right above mine, there was a family that had small kids. They argued a lot, and damn was it loud. They didn't even bother actually sending the kids to school either, because despite the children surely being at least 7 or 8, they never seemed to leave the block. They would stampede around the apartment and jump and scream from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m, and sometimes even past midnight. I was in my final year of university, so I barely had any lectures anymore. Was mostly studying from home, so I heard it all. They would actually jump so hard my ceiling light and glass stored on the shelves would rattle. I tried, of course, knocking on their door to ask them to keep it down a little bit. But half the time they wouldn't answer the door. The other half they would lie by saying that they were at work, with the kids being dropped at their grandma's. Yeah, of course. Must be those ghosts throwing a wild party in your place when you're out. And yeah, I was 100% sure it was coming from their place. I was desperate enough to listen at the door. Oh, and the kids would keep playing football around the house. Imagine the level of noise, with the ball being kicked and smashed on the floor just above your head. I tried talking to them about that too, but they shouted at me and said they weren't going to take the ball away and ruin their kids' fun. Then they closed the door in my face. Being out of options and hearing the kids never leaving their house, along with all the crazy arguments, my girlfriend and I emailed Child Services with an honest description of everything that was happening. They must have paid them a visit, because a few days later, in the late evening, the male neighbour appeared in front of our door, banging and ringing the bell like crazy. It obviously didn't work, so he started talking to us through the door, demanding that we open it and face him. He called us names and demanded we talk to him again, saying he wouldn't hurt us and he wouldn't do anything to us, etc. But he was 100% convincing, of course, especially when intertwining with being called bitches, etc. It took him at least 30 minutes of literal keeping the doorbell pressed and talking to us before he finally gave up. Not that it helped, as the situation didn't change a bit. Another thing I would experience living there is that I would keep getting random calls at night on my door phone. It would be at least 1 to 2 times a week, where someone would call around 1 to 2 a.m, and of course I never answered. I've always been terribly scared of strangers and home breaches. It sure didn't help with my fears. So I have no idea what the hell was going on. At some point, a letter from some resident appeared on the grounds floor dashboard. She was in her apartment, and while the door was closed, it wasn't locked. Somebody sneaked in while she was there in the living room and stole valuables from her purse that she'd left in her corridor. She was looking for any possible witnesses through the halls on her security cameras, but I guess they were just there for the theatre. A similar thing happened to a woman who I'd met in the building elevator. Somebody had heavily scratched and ruined her car when it was parked in the apartment block's guarded car park, which adds to my theory of the cameras not even working. Now, the block had 1 elevator for each wing, so in total there was 3, but you could only reach my apartment from 2 of them. Of course, since the place went to hell, there wasn't a single week when at least one of them wouldn't be broken. Sometimes both were. The machinery wasn't at fault. Most usually the button panel would be smashed or kicked in. The call button or the elevator's ceiling would be torn down too. We have a friend who's a police officer, and he was planning to give us a visit one evening. Sure enough, the elevator was broken, and he didn't know where the other one was, so he climbed the stairs. Now, the stairs would go around the shaft, so part of the stairway was hidden behind it, and as the place was huge, the stairs were rarely used by anyone. With some delay, he finally knocked on our door, looking quite astonished. It turned out that whilst climbing the stairs, he met with junkies injecting themselves behind the shaft. Well, unlucky for them, he's a cop, and he was more than happy to do his job. But imagine if someone who's not an officer met a bunch of drug addicts injecting themselves on your block's stairway. I guess that was the thing that finalized our thoughts of moving out. It went from grungy to slummy to straight out scary and dangerous. The place had cameras, but I doubt they even worked, and security that wasn't any better. So I live in the middle of nowhere. And what I mean by in the middle of nowhere is that my town is 3 hours away from the capital city of Alberta, Edmonton, Canada. It's very small and the police are usually called during the day, so there's hardly ever someone on duty during the night. I'm a 16-year-old girl who's a big video game addict, so I never leave my house other than for school or for work. My parents are divorced and my father works for the military. But my mum, however, works from home, and my stepdad works in the oil fields, so he wasn't home at the time. My parents both live in separate houses, and due to the past between my father and I permanently live with my mum and visit my father twice a month. Now to the story. It all started during October 2021, on a Wednesday afternoon. Every 2 weeks I get an early dismissal from school, and I get to leave at 1:30 p.m. instead of 3:10. But my bus never came to pick me and my sibling up on time, so our mum came to pick us up instead. She drove us home, and as we were entering our neighbourhood, there were police officers all around with police dogs. They were stopping every car in the neighbourhood to see who was in them, as they were looking for someone. They gave us no context of who they were looking for, and because we had multiple issues with missing children, etc., we didn't really care. We did what they asked of us and went home. Me being me, as soon as I got in, I went to my room and started playing video games, and chose to worry about my homework later. Around 6 o'clock, my mum came into my room telling me dinner was ready. So I went and grabbed my food and brought it to my computer room and chose to start on my homework. I transitioned from my bedroom to my computer room, and about 20 minutes later, my mum barged into the bedroom screaming my name. In a panic, I barged out the computer room yelling, "Mum, what's going on?" and ran towards her. Instinctively, she told me to cover up my windows and make sure every door was locked. And as I was doing that, my brother heard the commotion and asked my mum what was going on too. It turned out that my mum had been messaged by one of our neighbours with a video of the police in front of our neighbourhood's duplex. They were trying to break down the door because a man was shooting around his house, trying to push the police away, and we were living right beside it all. The police officers left the man's house after being shot at, and he was considered missing since he'd kept his family hostage and hadn't appeared at work within the past week. After a few hours of the police, MIA, missing in action, it was about 9 o'clock when my dad called me frantically, asking what was happening, since my mum thought the situation had calmed down and chose to text my father about what had happened. I told him I had absolutely no clue what had occurred since the screaming, shooting, and any other loud noises that had disappeared. But my dad being my dad, he put on his military clothing and went to the police station, telling them to get back there and do their job. The police then called the Edmonton SWAT team to come out towards my town, hence why they were MIA when they had officers hidden. This whole nightmare had been dragged out all night, and the SWAT team had brought in drones, etc. Because we had police officers around our house, we were told to stay inside, so we just headed to bed. I had woken up around 2 a.m. to more screaming and shooting, and in the morning my mum had received up to 10 videos from our neighbours, and the Edmonton SWAT team had gassed the duplex, broken into the house and managed to get everyone out safe and sound. As for the guy, he was caught with an illegal weapon and was put to trial. We don't know what happened since the trial, and we never thought about checking. My stepfather came home from his job early and quit that job to keep us safe. My dad and I started talking a lot more from then on, and he stayed in close contact with us since. We've had plenty of kidnappings in my area recently, and he's kept us up to date about it. We think it might have something to do with the guy's friends or dealers or whatever, since he had been doing many illegal things. Now this has nothing on some stories I see on here, but it had my adrenaline full throttle. I'm a thin, athletic guy at 5'9", so I'm not the most intimidating presence, but I happen to have a nice bulky coat on that probably added some uncertainty, which is also my saviour. It was 2:30 a.m. or so, which was my favourite time to do laundry. There's a 24/7 auto-electronic laundromat right by my apartment, and while there's employees there during business hours, there's roughly an 8-hour stretch where I'm the only one who will be in the building. I'll occasionally see an old-timer around 4:35 a.m., but usually only on Sundays, which I avoid. The place is literally half a mile from my place, so I zipped down there on a cold night, and it was well below freezing. I tossed in my clothes, soap, and swiped the laundry card, and on my way to grab gas, milk, deposit some cash at the bank, and back to my apartment to bring some things inside from my car, I did some dishes and decided to head back down to do my laundry. I usually play video games whilst running my laundry, or I just procrastinate, as I would let my stuff sit for up to an hour sometimes. There's no one there, so why not? But not this time. It was now just shy of 3 a.m, and I got the notification that my laundry was done on my phone, as I was seconds from the laundromat parking lot. I pulled in and scanned the lot, but no one was there. I proceeded to walk in the front door and immediately noticed someone come into the building from the far side door. It was a guy, maybe 6 foot, with 2 hoodies on, both hoods up, so most of his face was concealed. This side door was unlocked and often used when the place was busy, but there was no car there. There's a bathroom in the place as well. As I walked to my machines, which was about dead center in the building, I thought this person had quickly bolted outside. Just then I noticed him again, and I think he had ducked just by the door. Mind you, we had 2 islands of laundry machines between us, but he started up near the wall, which was on my left, and I was watching him at this point. I was hoping he'd needed to use the bathroom, but he hurried past it. Not a run, but a very quick walk. And now he was up on the opposite side, nearer the corner of the laundry machine strip, where I was maybe 15 feet away. He was just out of my line of sight for a moment, and I didn't want to trigger the guy or appear scared, so I continued shoveling my wet clothes into the laundry cart, and the adrenaline began trickling, and the hair on the back of my neck went up. Before rounding the corner and crossing back into my vision, he hesitated. I eventually turned my head to rotate back, and he kind of popped into the picture. He glanced over and we made eye contact as I reached into my coat pocket to find my keys. Then he continued up the aisle and made a left back out the side door. Now I have a little blade on my keys, so I popped that open and proceeded to toss my stuff in the dryer, while scanning my surroundings the entire time. Eventually the time came to go outside, and the front doors are automatic, so I had both hands free. I literally walked out of the place wielding a knife, shaking with adrenaline, but it was a ghost town, so I proceeded to my car and went home. I drove my wife into work and I waited until 6 to grab my clothes. My conclusion is that I'm nearly positive that this person had scoped out the laundromat, and my machine, well, all the machines, have a digital timer for the current wash. This guy had entered the building within a minute of it going off, and me pulling into the lot at 3 a.m, on a night when it was 20 degrees Fahrenheit out. Coincidence? Maybe. But I was scared either way. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button? I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.